Welcome. Today I'm going to show you how to replace the thermal pads on the NVIDIA MSI Ventus 3X 3080. Some of the reasons you might want to do this is to see better thermal performance from your graphics card if you see high stress on it and high temperatures. Let's look at some of those temperatures right now. So I've been experiencing a high GPU memory junction temperature. Typically an average of around 100 degrees, sometimes up to 104. And this is way too hot. So one of the things I'm gonna do is just replace those thermal pads with one that has higher thermal conductivity. So I've tried a few different kinds of thermal pads on these, and so far the 3mm works the best for the MSI version of the 3080, the Ventus 3X version of the 3080. And so far, this Extreme Odyssey thermal pad seems to have some of the best thermal conductivity that we could find. It has a 12.8 watts per meters Kelvin, which is pretty good as far as thermal conductivity goes for the graphics cards. So previously, we tried using a combination of 2mm and 1mm thermal grizzly pads and stacked them together. We did not see any good results or any change in the temperature at all. So we felt the need to find the 3mm pads. I was unable to find the 3mm from Thermal Grizzly in stock at this time, and this was the next best one. All right, so before we begin, let's make sure we have everything that we need. First, you're going to need your 3mm thermal pads. You're going to need some thermal paste. I recommend the Cryonaut from Thermal Grizzly. We've used that a few times. You're going to need rubbing alcohol. We recommend at least 90% or higher. You're going to need a small electronics tool repair kit. We recommend the one from iFixit, really great set. We recommend something to put your tiny screws in when you start taking apart the graphics card. We today are going to be using the lid from the iFixit because it has all these nice little containers for us. And then you're also going to need a straight edge blade, a fresh one, as well as a plate or something to cut your thermal pads on. Once you have all of your stuff set up, make sure that you unplug your computer, remove the side of your case to expose what we're going to be working on, and that is the MSI Ventus 3X Geforce Rtx 3080 from NVIDIA. So let's go ahead and remove that. We're going to start by removing the power cables. There should be two 8-pin connectors. Move them out of the way, just like that. All right, let's start by removing the card from the case. You probably have some similar screws, just like this. Go ahead and remove those. You should only need to remove 2 of them. So on mine, the graphics card holder, the silver part that holds it to the case, is underneath the black frame that holds the graphics card to the case as well. So I'm gonna have to remove that by just removing these other few screws. So be conscious when you're doing this in your case. Use your eyes and see what kind of things are holding your graphics cards to the case before you try just ripping it out. Okay, so now I can remove the holder, set it off to the side. Now my graphics card should be free to hit the pin down here, push it back, which should allow me to free the graphics card. So now that we have the graphics card out and on a clean surface, we're gonna start by unplugging the 2 connectors right down here, the white and black connectors. Takes a little bit of a tug. Make sure you're careful to not pull the wires out of the individual connector, but you're pulling out the connectors themselves. Once you do that, set them off to the side. So now that we have our power cables unconnected, what we're going to be doing is removing the screws on the back plate so that we are able to separate the back plate and the PCB from the heatsink and the fan side of the graphics card. So now that we have the cables removed and we know how we're going to be separating the back plate and the PCB from the fans and the heatsink, let's go ahead and flip the graphics card over so that the back plate is facing us. And now we're going to begin by removing the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 screws that are on the back of the graphics card. Remember when you take them out to put them in your container. So when you get to these 4 screws, you're going to notice that on one of them is a factory seal sticker. And the manufacturers will tell you that if you remove this sticker, that your manufacturer's warranty is void. And that could be true in some countries, but here in the United States, we are protected by the Magnuson-Moss Warranty Act. And through that, this sticker means absolutely nothing, and we are free to remove it without any further repercussion if we decide to claim any repairs under warranty at future dates and time. So I start by just carefully removing it, seeing if I can't keep it intact so that I can put it back on, as it's always easiest to just not have those conversations because they don't want us repairing our things or working on them, even when they send thermal pads that don't work quite as well as they should. You can see I'm totally mangling it. I'm not going to worry about putting it on because, as we said, it means absolutely nothing. But for you, if you are in another country, there are ways that you can do this very carefully and keep that warranty sticker on there, or remove it in a way that you're able to put it back on so that it looks like you never took it off. This is not legal advice. These are just simply things that I've heard about on the internet. Just like that. Now let's remove those screws. When removing the screws, you're going to remove them in a opposite direction, so catty corner. So remove this one, then this one, then this one, then this one. And I would do them a little at a time because this thing is under tremendous amounts of pressure and you don't want one side to come up and bend the whole thing. So instead we take our time and just undo each one a little at a time to ensure that we don't damage anything at all and that everything stays nice and secure. Once that's done, we can remove this piece, set it off to the side. Now that we have all of our screws removed, we can go ahead and separate the back plate and the PCB together from the heatsink and the fans. And it's gonna take some resistance. It might feel like there's still a screw in it, but just go slowly around the outside edges. All that resistance is just the thermal paste and the thermal pads that come from the manufacturer with a little bit of adhesion. This is what it's going to look like now that we have those separated. You can see the existing thermal pads that they send. We're going to save those. I'll show you in a moment. And you can see the thermal paste on our chip right here, as well as the residue that's stuck over here. So we'll probably start by cleaning this thermal paste. All right, so let's start by cleaning the chip. I'm going to take a paper towel and I'm just going to start by removing the old goop and thermal paste that is on this chip the best that I can. And again, this is just a dry paper towel, nothing on it, no chemicals, no alcohol. Really just trying to get the bulk of the goop off of the chip and off of the back of the heatsink. Okay. That's all I'm doing here is getting the bulk of the goop. You can see I'm not very good with paper towel management and using fresh sides, but that's okay, because neither are you. You can see this is wonderful coming right off. So now that I have the dry stuff done, we're gonna wet a paper towel with a little bit of alcohol to get it even more. I'll show you just the beginnings of that. Take our alcohol, wet it down. We use at least 90% or higher because it has less chances of showing pooling liquid when you go to wipe them down and dry them down. So you can see I'm taking the wet paper towel with the alcohol and just wiping down the areas even further. Once I'm done with this, I'll check back in and show you. So you may notice once it's wiped down that you still have some in the cracks. And what I like to do is take a Q-tip, wet it down with some alcohol, and use the Q-tip to really get in the grooves and clean this. Really take your time cleaning off all the old thermal paste, because when we add the new thermal paste, we need it to have really good coverage to ensure the best thermal conductivity. You can see we're not seeing much pooling. The alcohol dries almost instantly, which is very nice. Just like that. So now that we have the chip nice and clean and the heat sink, the back of the heat sink nice and clean, today we're only going to be focusing on and changing these thermal pads right here for those corresponding chips. We're going to be changing both the front and the back today. This is the front for now. If you only have enough to do one side, make sure you do this side, the one where the thermal pads go on top of the chips and on the back of the heat sink. This is the most important one. When we're done, we're not only going to be doing these, but we're going to be doing the flip side. On the reverse side, there's the same ones on this side. So we're going to be changing all of them today and showing you how to do that. But for now, let's start by removing these four on the back of the heat sink. So I went ahead and removed the old thermal pads from the back of the heat sink. And I saved them and didn't tear them apart because I want to be able to just use them as a cutting template to make it really easy. However, if for some reason they get damaged or if you need those measurements, the two long ones on the left and the right are 5.5 centimeters by 1.5 centimeters. This bottom one is going to be 4 centimeters by 1.5 centimeters. And this top one is going to be 1.5 centimeters by 1.25 centimeters. And those are going to be the measurements and what we're going to need to cut for our 3 millimeter thermal pads that we're going to be using. Now remember, when using these measurements or when cutting these, it's always a best practice to cut it slightly larger as opposed to slightly under. You never want to try to be exact and end up undercutting, because then you won't have enough coverage of the thermal pad on top of the chip to actually help conduct any of the heat. So always make sure that you're cutting either exactly the right dimensions or slightly above. It's better to be slightly over because you'll cover more of the chip, and if there's any extra hanging over, there's no loss. However, if you undercut, remember, there will be a huge loss and you won't see the results you're looking for. So to make it really easy, what I'm going to do is take out our 3 millimeter thermal pad, the new stuff we bought. I'm going to start with the long ones, and I'm just going to put it in the corner and try to match it up as best I can. Once I've done that, I'm going to take my blade, and while holding this, I'm going to cut my thermal pad, the new 3 millimeter one. See, on that one I cut it slightly larger, just outside of the line, to make sure we have plenty of room. You don't want to cut it too large because this stuff is expensive. So you see, I should be able to tear off now that piece. Should now be able to tear off that piece Just like that, we have a replicated piece of the thermal pad. So with one of those 3mm sheets, which by the way was 120 millimeters by 120 millimeters, I was able to complete two Geforce Rtx 3080s, both the front and the back changes on the thermal pads. This right here is for one complete 3080, both the front and the back thermal pads. This is what I have left over, probably enough to do another half a graphics card. And this was the original thermal pads that I removed that I'm going to put in a little container to save in case I need some in the future. So now that we have everything pre-cut and we're ready to rock, let's go ahead and remove the back plate from the PCB. And that's being held together with just 4 screws located here, 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 and here. So let's go ahead and remove those. Now, we have all 4 screws removed. We should be able to separate the back plate from the PCB. Sometimes it helps to use a prying tool if you have one, as the thermal pads really stick on there. I'll show you what that looks like. We're going to gently pry up the back plate and separate it from the PCB, revealing the old thermal pads that we will be replacing, as well as the back side of those chips. And remember, if you're limited on the amount of thermal pad that you have, it's always best to do this side. The reason that we're not so focused on doing this side is because the back plate on the MSI Ventus 3X is made of a graphite or graphene mixed with plastic solution. So it's not aluminum like some of the other cards, or a metal that would be more conductive to heat. So it doesn't draw as much heat, so we're not quite as worried about it. However, I like to be thorough, so we're going to be replacing the thermal pads on the back plate as well. Now, a few of my thermal pads weren't cut perfectly, and so I'm going to be using those ones for the back plate because it's the less important one. If your cuts are a little off, that's okay, but remember, we really would ideally like them to be perfect or slightly larger to make sure you're covering the full chip. And if you do have any imperfect ones, go ahead and use it for the back plate. So what I'm going to do is, just as I peel off each individual piece of thermal pad, I'm going to immediately replace it with the corresponding one that I have cut. So as I peel this off, I'm going to set this to the side, and then I'm going to grab immediately my other one. I'm going to peel off the back blue side, exposing the thermal pad, and I'm going to put it right back where that other one was at. And we're just going to drop it right in there, line it up as best we can with the markings from the previous one. Just like that. And I'm going to continue doing that for all of these. Give them all a little press on there. There we go. So now that we have these placed on here, if any part of it is hanging over the edge a little bit, you can cut that off or feel free to leave it. I don't think it's that important, so I leave it. I think it shows that I've taken the time to add better thermal pads on here personally. So what we're going to do now is remove the clear part of the thermal pad covering that's protecting it. Make sure that you're not peeling off the thermal pad itself, that it's still sticking nice and sturdy to the back of the plate. Just like this. Bada boom, bada bing. So now that we have the thermal pads on the back plate and we have the plastic pieces removed, let's go ahead and flip it over and line it up with the existing holes on the graphics card, which looks something like that. Now that we have it on there, I'm going to kind of gently press it against the card while I flip it over, because we have to screw in the screws from this side. Now that I have it flipped over, make sure my holes are still lined up. Looks pretty good. Once it looks good, we're going to go ahead and screw them in. I'm going to start with the two screws that were different. First is the long one that went in this corner hole. So I'm going to go ahead Shove it in there. Give it a little screw in. I'm not going to screw it all the way down, just enough to create contact. Then I'm going to do the next special screw, which was this small tiny one, and it went right here. So I'll go ahead, put the small screw in this hole and do the same thing. Start to screw it in so that it's nice and snug, but not all the way tight, just enough to make contact, like that. Then we have these remaining screws. Let's go ahead and grab those. You might need to use your thumb to push this in place, the side panel, while you screw them in. And the final one over here. Once I have all the screws nice and in there, I'm going to go back and tighten them all up. We'll just go hand tight, nice and snug. Just like that. So once we have those 4 screws in, you can take a look, kind of make sure that your card and those thermal pads are where they need to be. It might look a little warped or a little bowed out in some sections, but that's just because we haven't finished screwing in the rest of the screws on the back plate. So let's proceed with the installation. So now that the back plate is back on, we're gonna go ahead and put on the thermal pads that go on the chips themselves. And take note that these thermal pads were cut with a straight edge ruler to perfection to make sure that they cover the entirety of the chip. You do not want to cut corners on this section. You want your chips to be fully covered. And I ensure that I do that by, instead of placing the thermal pads on the back of the heat sink like they originally were, this is already clean, so we no longer have our marks to know where to put them. Although they put notches in the heat sink, we're gonna go ahead and just make sure that we put them on the chip themselves so that we can see and ensure that we're getting proper coverage. And so I'll take our thermal pads and we're going to place it gently to ensure that it covers the entirety of the chip line. I'm going to take a look on all sides and make sure that it's covered completely. Just like that. We're going to do that with all of these. So now that we have the thermal pads on, we're going to leave the plastic on them and remove that later, because first we're going to apply the thermal paste to the chip itself. And if you're interested in all the various different thermal paste application patterns, you can head over to the Gamers Nexus YouTube, and they have a bunch of in-depth videos on the best application patterns for thermal paste to get the best conductivity. What I'm going to be doing today is just a simple X with 4 dots in the corner. I'm going to take my time, do a little X like that, do it again, just like that. I'm going to do a 4 dots, there. You want to make sure that you cover the whole card. It's okay if a little goops out on the side. Something about like that. Now that it's set for a second and I look at it, this is probably a little excessive. I went a little heavy on the thumb when doing the X's and the dots, but that's okay. If you use a little too much, this thermal paste is non-conductive and won't damage any other part of the board if it spills over. However, this is probably a little excessive, so just keep that in mind when you're doing it. But this will also ensure that we get complete coverage of the chip with the thermal paste. So now that we have our thermal paste applied, we're going to go ahead and remove the plastic coverings on our thermal pads. Set them aside. Make sure that you're not pulling up the thermal pad from the chips. Make sure that you're not moving them around and you're keeping them with complete coverage of the chip. Now that we have the thermal pads applied, I removed the plastic. We have the thermal paste on. It's time to take our heat sink and fans and put them back on. So we're gonna line up all of our pieces. Something like that. And now that I think about it, it actually would have been smarter to just flip it the other way, because now I have to take my fingers, make sure it's sandwiched together, and flip it all this way, which is totally dumb and stupid of me. So make sure that you do it opposite of what I did. So there we go. Now that I have it flipped over from that little blunder, let's go ahead, take our screws, and begin to screw in the original screws that we undid. I'll start with the smaller ones instead of the ones in the center. Again, I try to go catty corner of each other just to ensure that we're getting equal pressure as we install these pieces. All that's left is to install this one. And again, we're gonna go counter corner. You're gonna have to give this one a little pressure. So get them all nice and snug, go back. Make sure they're nice and tight. That's it for the screws. So now that we have everything all screwed back in, we take a look, make sure it all looks good. Once it looks good, we plug back in our fans, the white and black connectors that we took out earlier in the very beginning. Just like this. And now we're ready to put it back in the case. So I'm going to start by putting in my bracket just hand tight. And it was on the lower 3 of the brackets. So now that we have our bracket in and it's loose enough to move up and down, let's go ahead and put in the graphics card. So we're going to grab our graphics card, line it up, push it in until that thing clicks. We can double check it, make sure that that clipped. It did. So now, before I tighten down the bracket, I'm gonna go ahead and insert the screws for the graphics card. Once we get the graphics card nice and tight in there and we know where it's supposed to sit, we can then tighten the bracket in the correct place to support it. Now that it's all secured inside, let's go ahead and plug in our power connectors. We have our 2 8-pin connectors. Make sure they're nice and snug. Take a final look, make sure that everything looks secure and good. And we're ready to put the side back on and plug it in. So we have the computer plugged back in, everything is turned on, and we have a stress test running. The mining is going, and right now we can check out some of these temperatures. Come on in. Remember before, we were running at about 100 constantly with a maximum of around 104. Right now we're running 86 degrees with a maximum of 86. We've been running this for about 45 minutes now, and huge degree of separation from what we had before. 104 down to 86. I'd say that's great results. So that is how you replace the thermal pads on the MSI Ventus 3X NVIDIA RTX 3080. Thanks for joining me today. I hope you learned something. If you want to see more stuff like this, make sure you subscribe to my channel, and make it a great day, and I'll see you on the next video.